studying flamenco dance at the point when my spouse was diagnosed. And the dance thread was another thing that really kept me going. And so that, again, the juxtaposition of actually looking, at what is death in the face and dancing. And so again, there's just these things to fit together that seem so at odds. And one of the quotes I put in my book is from F. Scott Fitzgerald, who said that the test of a first-rate intelligence, which we all like to think we have, right, is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time. And, that's a quote that I've heard a number of times over. But then there's the second part of that sentence, which is, and still retain the ability to function, which is, of course, the goal of the caregiver, just being able to function on a day-to-day or even hour-to-hour basis. And when I looked up that quote to see what it was from, I found the next sentence. And the next sentence for me even has even more resonance. And that is, one should, for example, be able to see that things are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise. And that final part of that final sentence just really spoke to me. How do you be determined to make things otherwise when they seem hopeless? So I'm going to read, it's a strangely written book. I kept a journal for a long time. Well, I kept a journal every single day through the process, the journey of caregiving. And then when it came time to write it as a book for other people, it kind of popped out into these strange little pieces of poetry, along with just regular old prose, and it all worked together. So I'm going to read from the piece called Hope and Acceptance. It became a constant, the move from hope to acceptance and back. There always felt to be shades of each and fluctuation between. I tried to pry them apart, to separate and examine, but felt like a child taking something to pieces that would never go back the same. There were days of more one than the other, and then moments that moved so completely, so quickly that I was lost. I tried to look acceptance in the face, whatever that might mean, then stepped back. I tested waters of each with Marty, that's my husband, which was the right temperature today. It was like dipping an elbow into the bathwater of a baby, in which combination could we swim? One day in August, he returned from a golf game, and he was buoyed by hope. The woman he golfed with in partner games had suggested that he ignore the diagnosis completely, and he had decided she was quite right. He'd set himself beyond hope to ignore. Also, she shared with him the work of a remarkable naturopath who could heal everything. This man had a practice 1 tunnel and 2 bridges away and was worth every dollar one could spend. I researched this person to discover he was a bowel specialist working with people living with Crohn's disease and other digestive and abdominal disorders. But at the moment of speaking of this woman, let's call her Melanie, and her admonition to ignore, I felt a jag of jealousy, not something I was used to. I think you experience that a lot as a caregiver. You have emotions come out that you didn't know existed in you. My feelings were mixed. Part of me wondered at how he could accept far-fetched thinking from another, when I had the feeling that if I were to articulate any hidden hope on my part, he'd pronounce it as foolish or rejected in some way. There was some primal jealousy here in me, unpleasant to look at, especially at this point in our lives, and something I'd tried to avoid in our relationship. Why did such have to come out now? Heightened emotion? Everything feeling sharpened and waiting with some ugliness in the sharpened? Followed quickly by frustration. I tried to talk with him about what was happening and how we might live with it. Maybe not ignore, but something of pushback. I'd always disliked the fight disease thing. There was something about the idea of fighting one's own body that never sat right with me. But a push might be it. Aren't our bodies intrinsic, psychological, emotional, mental healing, to my mind, was so connected to our body that I believed one could work almost entirely on the body and the emotional would follow. I'd done this in my own life, just hauled my bum to yoga class for months, not analyzing the process, letting it happen, and it did. In the first days after diagnosis, all I wanted to do was gather Marty's body in my arms and cry for it and comfort. I wasn't angry with his body. I had no desire to fight. But here someone else had handed him the idea of ignore, and I, as spouse, had to scrutinize my own feelings about this. How could such a thing bother me? If this was useful to him, I should be glad. Maybe what was really bothering me was the enthusiasm with which he embraced the idea. My weeks turning into months of ideas or plans felt more of doctor prescribing. Somehow, how and when, I'd become a spectacularly pragmatic person, a person of do and not dream. Batwoman. That comes from another chapter when I talk about trying to be a superhero. I thought to shake her off, even as I wondered at how to use this mental space of ignore. Within hours of talking about it, I did have to admit that the cloud under which we'd been living had indeed lifted. While it may still hang somewhere over us, it was high enough overhead not to be seen, not to cast quite the shadow it had. We had close to a week like that under the spell of ignore, or yes, it was bliss, or as blissful as could be. We used that time to revert to the types of conversations that ignored the basket of supplements in the middle of the table, and to laugh easily. It became a secret to hug to ourselves. We were able to sit through a visit with Dr. K, in which I found myself thinking, you don't know, this isn't happening, we're all right. Yes, it's true, I thought that. How does this happen? Because we want it to. The days slipped by and ignore shifted to hope again. Was signing the local non-miraculous naturopath's paperwork part of that? Until there was an evening by the fire when Marty broke down and tearily admitted he would do anything not to be facing the outcome. He said that already his golf game was going and he was feeling so physically weak. So ignore did not happen, So ignore did only happen because we wanted it to. My heart had to break. It's not even dried glue all over again. Who am I kidding? There was no glue. It was just spit. I realized how I too had wanted the pretense. Could there be somewhere in between, though? I finally talked about the research I'd been doing. I actually felt some gratitude toward Melanie because on some level, her advice was what had brought this to a head, brought him to a place of saying he'd try. He hadn't actually said that before this point. There was a guy in Australia who'd lived with ALS for 10 years, I told Marty, finally able to share. This is what this Aussie guy's been up to. I didn't share that this fellow readily admitted the diagnosis might be a bit off. I also shared thoughts on liver health. Maybe his drinking could be cut back, at least for the sake of a clearer mind. Alcohol, even just a beer or two, had been affecting him for almost a year now. We could see that retroactively. He nodded and talked about stopping vaping, which maybe wasn't as innocuous as proponents would have us believe. Maybe not, I said tentatively, scarcely able to believe we were having this conversation. 3 times he said avowedly that he'd do anything. Cleve, my son, loomed in the doorway and Marty asked him to fetch another beer. So maybe the plan would start tomorrow. I was torn. When struggling for life, do you focus on health, meaning do you listen to every piece of advice or information and strive to act on it? Or do you simply, if I can say simply, enjoy life, what there is of it, and every last moment? And how might you interpret this? What does it mean even to use words like struggle and enjoy? Marty wrapped up the evening by planning for a new diet, new. I'll do anything, he repeated. I found myself excited, full of hope, forget acceptance. Even before he was up the following morning, I was at the store buying from the list, purified water, grapeseed extract, and the highest quality green tea, the only thing I ever found documented in research. We ate breakfast. He was heading out once again to golf. We had plans later for a 9-hole game with 2 other couples. I would join him was the plan. I suggested that maybe instead of seeing this quitting as forever, it might be best to think of it as for a month. I said this because after 27 years, I had some idea of how he dealt with such things. But even so, I wasn't prepared when he looked at me in surprise and said, I can't quit anything today. Today is party day. Something in me went sink and thud when I heard this. What was that I'll do anything about? No, What I was feeling was more than sink and thud. It was sheer anger. It rushed into me from someplace I'd rather not think about, a wave of utter exhaustion. I realized not much was keeping me upright. Moments after Marty'd been picked up to go to the course, I was in my car running errands, and as I drove the highway, I found myself screaming at the top of my lungs. It wasn't the first or last time the car was a refuge for such. Ah, the fricative of a certain word that just feels good coming out. How was it that I'd spent hours, days, weeks inside books, online, phoning, asking, trying to find ways to live with this? How was it to feel things become dust in my fingers and watch as the wind swept them away, to hear laughter at me and hope, forget everything? Then I went home and made quinoa salad of my guilt. Ignore was never a real option. But later, when I joined him on the golf course, I was brought up short by the realities of his new game. He stumbled and tottered. His putting was the one and only element that could at all be relied on. On hole number 5, I made a quick trip to the little toilet shed, wiped my eyes and blew my nose, humbled and quieted by the courage he showed on the greens, just trying to enjoy his game, his party day.
Can I just join in and say one thing that your writing is so intense, so true, and I could just feel it. And I probably forgot to introduce, but I must say that Alison has been teaching in the University of British Columbia for the School of Creative Writing. Yeah, and she is the founder of a newsletter for the School of the, if you would like to mention it, the Unwriters School, right?
Yeah, I've started a writing newsletter on Substack, and it's called The Unschool for Writers. I've actually, after 14 years, I've actually just left UBC. So I'm trying to take years of teaching and writing and do something else with it for people who want to write. So it's been fun. So that's been good.
Beautiful, beautiful. Over to you, Bhavana.
Thank you. So I think that shows just that going back and forth with different emotions and the juxtaposition of such disparate pieces always. That's just how it ended up feeling to me. And there's the word guilt. That word guilt kind of pops up. I went and tried to turn it into quinoa salad instead. But I'm coming from this odd place, I think, in that my spouse had ALS. And then about a little more than 2 years after he passed, we'd all been thinking that my father was dealing with maybe the results of some sort of a stroke situation. He was having issues with speaking, and it never occurred to us that after everything my family, extended family, had been through, that we would have someone else in the family unrelated to my husband with ALS. And my spouse's started in his hands, which was very noticeable because he was a musician and a guitar teacher. And my dad started with speaking, breathing, eating. So I've been through this, being the primary caregiver for my husband, and then supporting my mom and her journey, being primary caregiver for my dad. And that's one thing I feel so strongly about, is this idea of sort of caregiver guilt. Oh, I shouldn't have done this, or I should have done that. Or, at some point, my mom is 30 years older than me. My dad was a much bigger man than my husband was. Marty was only about 140 pounds. I was in good shape. I was young. I was, 50, 51. So we were able, and I promised him he would stay at home. And I talk about that in the book, how that promise, he always was at home. But, at one point, a nurse friend of mine said, "You had no idea what you were promising." And she was absolutely right. I did have no idea at the time. But to see my mom and dad go through that, and, yeah, and talking about boundaries. I was thinking about, the piece about boundaries, and we talk a lot about boundaries. We talk about boundaries with from children to adults to caregivers to it's all around us. We talk about, where are our lines? And I thought, it's so ironic that you can actually end up feeling guilty about not being strong enough to create boundaries. I found my spouse's iteration of ALS was so quick. He was ill for not even a year, whereas my father, from beginning to end, it was about 4 years. So with that different pace, Marty was so quick that every week just changed and changed. Every week was a new challenge, and I was constantly having to just, I was having to be creative. I was thinking about creativity is oddly, I think, a huge part of caregiving, because you're constantly problem solving and coming up with things. And I found too, sometimes I was so exhausted, I would forget the stuff I already know. And it'd be too easy to do that because I was just moving from week to week. So I think, some of the things I might say about boundaries are almost more things, hindsight is 2020, and I can see clearly things that I might have done. But in that 10 and a half months where life was just moving too quickly, there was a lot I didn't see. And I'm just not going to feel guilty about that. And I've done that with my mom. At some point, my father did go into care, and we have conversations. I'm motioning over there because I'm actually in my mom's house and she's over there asleep. But we have conversations like, Mom, you can't, she'll feel guilty. He should have stayed at home. He shouldn't have gone into care. It's like, no, when you get out of that caregiving place of exhaustion, you can see, oh, I should have done this. And it's like, no, you did the right thing at the right time. So I think it's so important to really keep that in mind.
May I step in at this point?
Yes.
I believe that, first of all, thank you so much for reading out of your book, which I think is a beautiful journal, insightful, and it gave me a beautiful picture of what might be, what might have been your journey, so relatable. I was taken into my car at some point when I was looking after my dad, and the car being the refuge. What a beautiful expression. And again, another beautiful metaphorical expression of making the quinoa salad. I'm going to remember that for a while. I get goose flesh as I speak it. So thank you for reading that out. And thank you for writing that for all of us. I'd just like to take a moment to pause that creative expression, the ability to step back and journal what you're going through, truly incredible and commendable, because I do think that absolutely hindsight is 2020. And I think you also tend to look at it with a little fantasy, a little romance, a little later. But when you're really going through it, it's another thing. I do think, I do wish that more and more caregivers would journal and talk about the real emotions that they have to juxtapose or juggle during the caregiving journey. So that, thank you for being the role model of that. Second, I do think that in reading out from your book and talking to us about your experience, highlighting the tension for the boundaries is a very important one, because if we were to bring in the Indian or the South Asian culture, but I do think it's a universal culture, right, where families and familial roles and responsibilities do not help you create tight boundaries for yourself. So, I would like for you to help us see how important it is to create the boundaries for yourself when you are feeling pulled into your role of a good wife, a good daughter, and so on and so forth. It's definitely an Indian thing, but I do think that it's a universal thing as well. So,
yeah, I think, looking back, I think the things that helped me to create, I don't think I was even thinking of the word boundaries at the time, but since the time I was quite young, I've had a really strong sense of who I am, and a real need to protect that inner person. So I've often made decisions or choices to do things that I think can seem possibly selfish, possibly. Taking time for myself, in strange ways. They may not have been ways that were visible because I was really there 24/7. And I found that, particularly with my husband, the difference between my husband and my dad was a carpenter. He was a very humble person. He was very quiet. He would go off, do his job, come home, didn't like a lot of attention, didn't have a lot of friends, really worked and had family and fixed his house and did the yard work. And, that's who my dad was. And if there's one thing I really came to know is that people die in the same way that they live. I mean, I think there's the odd exception to that, but for the most part, that's how it works. So my dad never wanted to be a bother. And, at one point, my mom shared with me that he would get up once in the night with his walker and go have a pee and come back to bed and fall asleep. Because that's my dad. That's how he did things. Eventually, my mom would be helping him to the washroom, and then he went into care and they did. Whereas my spouse was an extreme extrovert. He loved people. There were over 900, I still can't believe this. There were over 900 people at his memorial service, which I think, unless you're a celebrity, most people don't have 900 people. He taught guitar. He was very active with the boys' sports, and he was a musician, and he loved to play in front of people, and he loved that attention. And what that translated to being his caregiver was that he wanted a lot of attention, and I was the only person around. So, and I didn't unpack that and put it together until after, but that meant in practical terms that he was up every 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes throughout the entire night, which I thought was normal caregiving. When my doctor looked surprised, when the public health nurse looked surprised, I thought, what are they surprised about? This is just how he gets up and does things. And, it'd be blanket fixing and toilet and water and all night. And I realized that's what that was about. So I had to do things like just say, okay, I need to sleep for an hour, wake me up in an hour. Or I had to nap during the days. So I had to figure, again, it's that sort of keeping your mind in a place where you can creatively come up with ways for you to get through. And I think too, that having children, my children ranged in age from 16, they were 16, 19, and 23 at the time. And I kept thinking, I need to keep my strength together for my children. And, that, I know that sounds like just more work, but it gave me a purpose to stay healthy, keep it together. And I also know that I love to write. And it's really, really important to me to write. And I think, every caregiver has something that they do just for their self. I know in the UK, and I don't know where else, but I know in the UK, at least they used to have a budget for people who are caregivers, because they have so many of them there, apparently, that they would actually, the government actually pays for you to maintain a hobby during caregiving, which I thought, wow, like that's amazing, because I had Marty's golf foursome. The other three guys in its golf foursome would actually take turns coming into the house in the evening to sit with him while I went to my flamenco classes. And really,
Wow.
it was such a gift. In the last few months, they just couldn't, because there was just stuff that only I could do, and they just couldn't do it. Like using a catheter and things that Marty just really would have been very uncomfortable with friends doing. But up until that last few months, they would come Tuesday and Wednesday nights and let me go to my flamenco class, which was just amazing. So to hang on to those pieces was really, for me, very critical. And often the journal writing piece ended up being done in the middle of the night. Like I knew he'd be awake every half hour, so I would just sit there and write, which really meant for me that I was processing my day by day, what I was doing step by step. None of that is in the memoir. The journal is something completely very raw. I wouldn't wish anyone to read it because it's so raw. But I could not have written the book, the memoir, without the journal. And I really needed the journal just to get through the day or the night.
So, Alison, you make some beautiful points that kind of resonate with me personally for my story and for a lot of things that we see around. Now, as an organization that is in the business of supporting family caregivers, we have a certain framework in which we talk about the caregivers and their well-being. Yeah, I believe the first beautiful point that you make is that of writing your journal, expressing yourself, having some form of your creative expression. Now, in the elements of well-being that we speak about, and usually people find it the hardest to relate with, is creative expression. And absolutely beautiful that not only do you as an individual have your own creative expression, but there is a government system that supports your pursuit of creative expression, hobbies, because caregiving can be very, very challenging. And to your earlier point of caregiver guilt, I think this gets compromised most. How can I think about myself and my hobby when the person I love is struggling for life? At least that was my question.
I think because, it's the same thing as the sitting in the airplane when they give you the instruction for the little yellow thing that's going to pop out of the ceiling if you need it. And before you can put it, help your children with it, or the elderly person you're with, you have to put the oxygen to yourself. And it really is like that. Like there's going to be nobody there for this person who needs help if you don't take care of yourself. So I completely understand that in the day-to-day, the hour-to-hour, that can easily get forgotten. But it can't, because it's just not going to serve anybody if you don't even do something. I mean, when I think of the amount of time I actually spent daily writing, it wasn't a huge amount of time. Neither was the time I spent going to flamenco. So, flamenco classes, maybe, 2 hours a week and 40 minutes of travel time. And then writing each day was usually done when Marty was asleep. So it wasn't taking anything from his care. And then the rest of the time was really, really focused on him. And especially in the last 3 months, food just turned up. I actually wrote a poem about that. Food I cooked twice in the last 12 weeks. I was so blessed by family and friends who brought food. They would just come in the house, put it in the freezer, and walk out again often. Or I would open the front door and something would be on the step, which was just, I can't tell you how many times I cried about that, just because it was so, such a beautiful thing to do for people to do. Taking care of yourself doesn't have to take a lot of time, but I think those little pieces on a daily basis, and people would come over with gifts of a few different types of tea for me, or bubble bath, which was so thoughtful. So again, not a lot of time, but I think you have to take that bit of time every day.
Absolutely. No, I think that explaining to people why your creative expression, whether it is in your journaling or it is for your hobbies, has been a huge struggle for us. And we do think that it gets a little difficult for us to explain to people why this is a critical element of your well-being, especially when caregiving is front and center. And I do think that you highlight a beautiful point about the many ways in which well-wishers can support. I do think that, so there's an expression locally here. Typically, somebody would look up a patient or a caregiver. They are likely to leave with an expression of saying, let me know if there's anything I can do. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's a gap, because I do think that the caregiver cannot ask. It's not easy, or they're not mindful, or they don't necessarily remember what to ask for. So it is useful if friends and family know that, just leaving some food is a good idea.
Yes. I think that there's so many things that people can do. It was interesting, people coming and going when we had the service, and it was time to put together, I want to say the pamphlet, what's the word for it?
Flyer, pamphlet.
Yeah, communication. I actually put a note in there because I found, ALS is a tough disease for friends to come over and visit you and feel comfortable.
That's right.
We had one friend who'd actually been an adult guitar student of Marty's. And the first time he came visiting, I could see that it was just, he'd pushed himself to come up to the front door and knock, and he was ready to run any moment. Maybe he was hoping we wouldn't answer. He came in, he was so awkward and he was so uncomfortable. And the whole time he was there, which wasn't long, maybe 15 minutes, I really had to try to make him feel comfortable, because I could just see it was so important to him to be there. And he came 2 other times, and he was more and more relaxed each time he came. And it was just a gift, actually, to me that he even came, just because it was so important to him. But I was also aware of all the other people who didn't or couldn't come. And I actually put a note in this program. That's the word I'm looking for, in the service program. If you didn't come and you're feeling badly about it, please absolve yourself. Marty was never somebody to go and visit people in the hospital. He didn't go visit people when he couldn't take it. I said, of all people, he would have been the first person to understand why you couldn't come. And it's not an easy disease to see. So if you didn't come, here you are at the service. Thank you for coming to that. You know, let it go. Let it go. Because honestly, we had the right amount of visitors. The people who had to come, who had to bring things, that was the perfect amount. If I'd had all of the people come who thought they should, it would have been completely overwhelming. And at one point, I remember one day we had several, family members coming, important, not friends, not neighbors, but family members. And when I listed off who was coming, Marty actually burst into tears. It just meant too much in one day. And I actually had to phone people and say, you can't come today, or you can come, but for 15 minutes and that's it. So there are many things you can do without ever showing your face. And I had somebody notice that I was painting I needed to paint. We'd renovated the bathroom. She said, what color do you want it? I told her what color, just never thinking. Next thing I know, she's come back with paint chips. And she says, so which one of these do you want? How about this one? She didn't really leave me a lot of choice about, what can you do? She just did it. And then she went and got the gallon of paint and came back with her paint clothes on and helped me paint. That kind of stuff, to actually think about, okay, where are they at and what can I do to help without asking, what can I do? Just do it.
Great point. Absolutely. I think friends and family can make a big difference. And I'm so glad that you have given these real life experiences, instances, because what it does is, for us in our community, I think it encourages caregivers to recognize that it is okay if they are not able to ask. This is what happens. You are articulating for them their struggle, one, and two, from the point of view of all the well-wishers. I think for them to know and overcome their helplessness. I think a lot of times when we are well-wishers for someone else, we have to get over our sheer sense of helplessness, because watching the disease is so difficult, like you pointed out. We feel helpless. We want to do something, and we just don't know what. So it's great to have these examples. You could just come and paint a wall.
I had people drop off novels. And, I've been teaching writing forever. I've had to do a lot of reading, and honestly, at that point in my life, I'd kind of lost the joy of reading fiction just to read a story. So I found myself, when I wasn't scratching in my journal late at night, I would actually read a novel, and it was such a treat. It just got me completely out of the house into another space. And I think there were 3 novels brought to me when I was going through that time. So again, there are random things that people came up with that were just of them and anticipating some need in me. And they just kind of hit right on the right. I don't even know how people do it. It's something about when you think about somebody else. What do they need? This would be cool. Okay.
Such a beautiful thought. Can you keep the caregiver in your mind? And I'm going to correlate it with the other thought that I had, but I hadn't completed. I love your expression of we die like we live, and the comparison of the 2 people in your life that you have seen, and how their personalities determine the role that the caregivers have to end up playing. So I could see reflections of that in how I have seen my mother as a caregiver, in how I have been a caregiver to different people, and their personalities playing a role and having different demands on us as caregivers. So thank you for highlighting that as well. I do believe that's a very, very beautiful point. I would like for you to talk about, in your journey, therefore, as you look back on it, what would you as a person have needed, like you've highlighted? You as a person are a reader, person who reads fiction, and what your friends could do was leave probably a novel or two. Food, maybe you wouldn't have asked. What else?
I could have done with, I could have benefited from people saying, can I come and just sit with Marty for an hour while you go do stuff or while you nap? I could have used more of that. So, when I was doing something like going dancing, people stepped up and said, hey, I'll be there. But just to have somebody say, how about if I just come over and sit with him for a while and you go nap? That would have been amazing. So that's, yeah. But there again, and that's the thing, when you say, tell me what I can do for you, that often the caregiver's mind just goes blank because you're on this trajectory. You've got these tasks to do all day or all night, and you really cannot think, oh, what can somebody do? I found myself often in the role of docent, sort of telling people, what is ALS? What's it about? What are the symptoms? What does it look like? And then a docent of grief. Well, this is what it's like to grieve. Which is just such a strange, you feel like putting the sign on the door. This is the Museum of Grief. I'll tell you all about it. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting. I did find myself reading the Joan Didion book, The Year of Magical Thinking, which is about becoming a widow and her dealing with grief. Which again it was motivating to want to write my book because I wasn't writing about the grief after passing. I wanted to look at specifically what it is to be wife and caregiver with ALS, with a terminal disease. But I think because I was living with that that diagnosis, I could actually let myself read books like that. I don't know if I would have read that book if it was something with some hope attached to it. So there's that sort of anticipatory grief thing that you deal with, where you're having to think about the future. So that's a very different piece of caregiving.
So, Alison, I think that it's beautiful. It's a gift to the world that you come from a field of writing and you were able to put your life experience into writing a book and expressing yourself and actually showing the light to so many people that this can actually, this is a roller coaster ride. It is normal. It has these challenges. I'm going to hand over to you to tell us, why is it important to tell your story? Why is it important to tell stories you encounter?
I really had this feeling that, I was going to say, I really had this feeling that I was alone. No, that's not true. I really had the feeling that other people have gone through this. I'm not the only one, but I couldn't find their stories. And I had this, I think it's maybe because, before I was a writer, I was a reader. And all throughout my life, whenever I'm going through something, I look for a book about that thing. So I was looking for books. I read, like, as I said, the Joan Didion book. I read Joyce Carol Oates' book. Again, that was on widowhood. It wasn't about caregiving. I looked at a number of self-published books. I think sometimes, I feel like it's the kind of material that a writer really needs an editor to be working with them. As I said, my journal is a completely different book than the memoir. And I think it's so important to process your written material so that it's not just for you, but it's for the reader. And so I had to go through that process. And I think it's so significant to share what it is to get through. Things like, and maybe this sounds really odd, but I showed you in the memoir, there are these passages that look like poems, and then there's passages that just look like regular narrative. And the regular narrative is past tense. So that, because there's sort of this subconscious thing, I think, that happens as a reader when you read something that's not easy to read and it's written in past tense, that this person lived through to a point where they can tell you the story. And then the passages about the really difficult stuff, telling my sons that their dad has got this horrible disease. That was a chapter, and it was just so long and so awful. I thought, who on earth wants to read this? This is too hard to read. And suddenly it kind of crunched down to a handful of words. And I realized, oh, if I write this as a poem, there's a lot of white space around it. You can absorb the words. I did write it in present tense. So it has this sort of, again, I didn't think about that too consciously. It just sort of happened. And I realized that these tough little pieces come out in present tense in just a few words. And I think there's something about reading poetry, even if you think you don't like poetry, it's just free verse. It's not kind of scary poetry. It's just a handful of words, and it makes it more digestible somehow. So I think not only telling a story, but finding a way to tell it and then sharing them. I think it's just so, I know I needed the stories. So I needed them really badly.
And if we were to think about it like this, the fact that you told your story connected us to you, brought you to us, and to so many more people who are impacted by ALS in India. I mean, miles away. And, each time I say this, I get goose flesh, but I do want you to know that in just listening to your story, I feel not alone. And I feel that, yes, for example, in my particular case, I saw my dad who didn't have ALS, but he had multiple system atrophy, a cousin neurological condition. But I can relate with the period that you may have gone through, my mother went through. I was similar age as your children. I just feel it's not just happen. It didn't just happen to me.
Right.
So thank you once again for writing your story, despite the fact that you didn't find too many. And we hope that your sharing this will inspire many, many more people to tell their story.
Mm.
That is our purpose for this series as well, that can we hear authors and can we inspire many more authors. Would you like to honor, recognize someone in your journey who you think played a significant role that you encountered while writing your book?
Oh, well, one person I really notice is our family GP, our family doctor, who, again, we lived in a small town at that point. I've moved since, but we lived 10 minutes away from my parents. So my father actually shared the same family doctor that we had. And by some odd fluke, he'd had 3 patients with ALS before, which is most unusual. Many doctors never have one. And he was about 70 at that time and still practicing as a doctor. And he actually started, at a certain point, he started just to come by our house on his way to work once a week. He would stop by and just see how things were, which saved us bundling up and climbing in and out of the car, which became just so awkward. So he was just this huge, huge blessing. And I think to have my 3 sons, and my youngest son at the time had been homeschooling for 7 years. And I think if he'd gone back to school that year, it would have been really shocking. So he was at home. And I made a point of not asking for his help maybe as often as I needed it, because I was very aware that he is only 16. There's only so much I can ask of him. But it was nice to have his presence in the house. And I think that his presence in the house also was just really wonderful for Marty to have too. So it was, we had this big, nice house with windows from floor to ceiling. So we could, even when you were indoors, you felt like you were still sort of outdoors. So it too, it was a nice setting to go through a tough time. So yeah, my sons and our doctor, we were very lucky.
Thank you. Thank you. It is not a coincidence, I believe, that today is Mental Health Day world over. And we are having this conversation with you. Caregiving and its challenges, our love for each other, our desire to care for another person who might be struggling with health, impacts our overall well-being, specifically our mental health. And it is very important that caregivers are able to address their mental health issues, because often they are not priority. The physical health of the person suffering takes so much space that mental health, which is so invisible, and that of the caregiver just really falls to the bottom of the priority list. We have always felt that caregiving journeys come to an end. This particular conversation, as it is nearing to its end, earlier you had mentioned your lovely encounter with someone who spoke about #FinishWell. So I'd invite you to help us finish well.
Okay. That was just such a joy. And I actually reached out to this person whose name is Steve, or was Steve. I reached out to his wife and asked, can I share a little bit about Steve's story, because he just really has inspired me. And I came across him on Facebook with the ALS Caregivers page there. And he was just a very funny guy. He would get his kids to put wigs on him and dress him up. And he brought a lot of joy to people's lives. And that is how he added the #FinishWell. And he put together, he passed in the spring, this recent spring. And his wife continues to post for him, and she's very generous with sharing letters, notes, cards, just beautifully heartfelt things. And again, funny, signature humor. The guy was just so funny. He's made monthly envelopes of Bible devotions for his family, for instance, to be opened on a certain day. So each month his wife opens these envelopes that he left for this year and shares them with the children. He's written a collection of letters to his kids to be, opened on their wedding day, their high school graduation. And I'm sometimes I think I think about things from the caregiver's side, but he really helped me to think about things from the person we are caring for, and how he took up the responsibility of building his life, his heart, his soul, who he was, what he would leave behind, his legacy. And often he would share, they'd had a really rough day. He would maybe, be open about being kind of grouchy or whatever, just those normal human things. And then he would talk about what his wife was doing as a caregiver and how wonderful she was and how much he thanked God for her. And he would wax on, and it would just make me cry just to see how he was living. Again, that thing of this is how he's lived his life, and this is how he's doing the finish well thing. And he completely inspired me. So I have to share that because he was just so inspiring.
Indeed, indeed. And I think that, it leaves you with this question that who is really the caregiver? Is the one providing physical care the caregiver? Or someone like Steve, who really is an example of providing emotional care also to the caregiver? So really, it would be quite a question.
Yeah, it really is. And, I found with my book, I actually had a colleague who's much younger than me. And, he's in good health. His wife's in good health. He came to the book launch. He bought a copy. And next thing I know, couple nights later, I get an email in the middle of the night. I looked at, not that I was reading it in the middle of the night, but I find it the next morning because he just read the whole thing. And he said what it made him think about. He knew it was about death. He was kind of terrified to read it. And in the end, he said it wasn't about that so much for him. It made him think about how he's living now, how he and his spouse communicate, maybe what they don't communicate about, maybe what they should communicate about. And it made him really think about how that works now so that the relationship is built before anything like this ever happens. So I actually found that really gratifying, just to think, okay, this is good. Like we all do need to think about that, whether, partnership, but just, in terms of family or friends, people potentially that, we could end up taking care of, or they could end up taking care of us.
Indeed. Absolutely. And frankly, it takes me back to the beginning of your talk where you spoke about how the caregiving journey was an experience for you to juxtapose apparently polar ideas and hold them together. I do think that in, for example, the Buddhist tradition, there is the belief that you can live well only if you can encounter or think about death well.
Right. Yes.
So we cannot run away from the fact this is the only universal truth. And that's something a friend of mine says, one thing that we all have to do is die. So holding that with respect allows us to live well.
Yes.
And in doing that, thank you for showing us the way. Thank you for being an inspiration for writing. And I would like to take the one question that has come up, which is that we know that you wrote daily, and that journal is such gold for us right now. But you must have been exhausted. What do you recommend? What did you do? And what do you recommend that caregivers be mindful of for the exhaustion caused by caregiving?
It goes back to that thing of asking for help, and sometimes you don't know how to ask. I did have somebody come in 3 times a week for 3 hours, or 1 hour 3 times a week, to come in and shower Marty. I think if it feels completely overwhelming, just to make yourself take time to sit down with a cup of tea or coffee or something and just go away. So it's just you in a corner somewhere, and sit down and take a breath and think about, if nobody's offering, and I've gone through sort of these anecdotes about how people would help out and bring things, but if nobody is helping you, then you do, I think, have to at some point sit down and say, okay, what do I need? Because I need help. Like to actually recognize that you need help, and what, I must admit, when I go through, say, the ALS caregiving page on Facebook, and I see people say, I've been doing this for 5 or 6 years and I have no help, nothing, and go through the hardness of it, and nobody is there to help them. I'm just, it brings me to tears, because I did not have a lot of help, but the help that I had was just critical. But I know what it's like to be caught up in that trajectory where every minute you're busy, 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 busy. And if you have no help, you have to get it, because you can't keep going. You can't keep going. So a friend, a family member, somebody reach out. I'm not sure what it's like there in terms of, doctors and public health nurses, or I found, we had one young man turn up from the public care program, because we do have a medical plan in Canada that's supposed to pay for some things. Well, we had a young man show up who did not know what he was doing. I spent half the time educating him on ALS, the other half the time watching him before he made a mess of things. And then I knew he wouldn't be the one to come back the next week, because they just have a rotation of people. So I knew I'd end up doing the same thing. And I said, no, don't send anybody, because they don't know what they're doing. And I don't have the energy to teach them. I might as well just do it myself. So I did find one person who was a wonderful, wonderful, he was actually a retired musician, and he was so full of respect, and he was able to shower Marty, 3 mornings a week. And that was just a huge, huge help. I don't know if that's very helpful, but if you can just somehow find the time to stop and think, if you really have no one else to do that for you.
I think it's a great point, Alison, because I do think that, for example, when I think of myself, or I think of my mother, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, it's a little easier to be on an adrenaline rush, right? You mindlessly just go about the task that you're doing, and you just kind of get things done. But I think the biggest piece of advice that we can give to ourselves as well as to other caregivers is to not be on that high adrenaline, but to look at the long run and say that you do need to pause and you do need to replenish yourself along the way. Not, I will do this after this is done.
Yeah, you really can't. I think too, to listen to your body. And, if there's one thing I'm left with after this journey, I now have a body that tells me when I need to stop. So for instance, I don't grind my teeth, but I so clenched my teeth that I actually destroyed a molar. When I went to have it fixed, it was just completely not fixable, because I just so clenched and I could feel jaw pain. I had intense jaw pain. And now whenever I feel that, in fact, a big part of the reason I left my position at UBC is because I could feel my jaw. Wow. And my body now tells me, like, no, you're going too far. And I think that's part of being a caregiver, is you really need to listen to that, because when your body's not happy, you're quite useless for everybody out there. So especially the person you're supposed to be taking care of. So listen to your body.
Such a brilliant, insightful point, Alison. I think we stop listening to our bodies and we stop tuning in to our intuition, as if, we can somehow get through this. And that can be quite a counterproductive thing. So thank you for highlighting that. I'm going to pick up a question from a dear friend, Pinakin, who himself is living with, like you said, pushing the boundary of ALS, but he is quite, a soul. He's running a community of other caregivers and patients of ALS. And he is asking you that, can you please speak to the idea that caregivers need emotional and psychological support? Can you just talk about that? Like, what is the kind of support and how can they get it?
It's such a huge issue. And I think it's, fine to say, well, there are counselors and therapists, but, I found a lot of that. One thing, sorry, my brain's just trying to really come up with an answer, because I think to find a counselor, somebody you really connect with, is not easy. And it can take time to find somebody who connects with you. And in the meantime, you're just left with yourself. I found, and this sort of goes back to that thing of visitors, people thinking they need to come and visit you. And when I said, really, we had just the right number of visitors. If we'd had any more, I think I would have lost it. But I needed vast amounts of quiet. And I usually love music. And all I did after my husband passed was go see live music, especially jazz, because I love being like 20 feet away from people playing music in front of me. To me, that's all the meds that I needed for grieving, because and it was normal for me to actually drive into the city 4 times a week to go hear music for a while, which I think people had thought I'd completely lost my mind. But when I was actually going through caregiving, I needed quiet. I needed the television off. I needed just silence. And I think I needed that silence to just process everything I was going through. And again, it's like listening to, jaw pain or joint pain or whatever you've got going on, just to think about, what do I need right now? Is kind of key. Oh, I need quiet. Oh, I need a cup of tea to slow me down. I need a small glass of wine. I need, whatever it is that you need, try to, think about. Sometimes I actually had to pause and think about, what is it I need more quiet for? So I think things like that, it's really hard to give this a definitive answer, because everybody's so different. But what is it, to stop and say, what is it that feeds me? Does that answer the question? Okay, I see the thumbs up. Thank you. Good.
So I agree with you that you make a brilliant point, again, for the nth time, about how, yes, I mean, it's a straightforward answer to the question is, yes, caregivers need emotional and psychological support, but let's just be nuanced about it, that emotional support cannot come always from a professional counselor and therapist, because it takes a long while to get to that person. So while the support is required, it perhaps has to start from the person, and it can start from the person only if they have moments of quiet. So giving caregivers respite can be a good starting point. And the next is that it usually comes from friends and family who need to be a little more sensitive to caregiver needs. so you can get to a professional at some other stage. So thank you for helping us clearly see that. I want to also ask you the next question, which is, do caregivers have to face tantrums of the patients sometimes, many times?
That's interesting. Well, again, people are all so different. So my father certainly was extraordinarily patient. He was always concerned about my mom. He was sort of really the ideal person to have to take care of. Really, he was very understanding. My husband, to be really honest, and I think we need to be honest with these stories, he was of the persuasion of, silent treatment. And he did this long before he was sick, and he did it while he was sick. And I found it very hard. So it wasn't a tantrum, but you have so little communication with ALS, and particularly he was unable, they got to the point where he was unable to type because cognitively, ALS has this spectrum. 20% of people with ALS have a very clear mind. And that was my dad. My dad's mind was so clear up until right until that last moment. Marty, on the other hand, got increasingly fuzzier and fuzzier to the point where he could actually not type a message for me in the last 4 or 5 weeks. So the only way we had to communicate was to look at each other. So when he made the decision not to look at me, it was actually very painful. And I would say it was the equivalent of a tantrum. In those moments, I just had to take a very deep breath and I had to walk away. And I think that's a boundary thing. It's like, I need to exit. Sometimes I had to leave the room. So I think to know, what you need to do and then do it is pretty important, because you don't want that anger. You can't be looking after somebody with anger in you. It's not going to be good for them, and it's not going to be good for you either. So I think, vats of forgiveness are things to plunge into. That's just got to be there. And I think that's, again, somewhere where if you need to get away for a few hours, call somebody and then get away for a few hours. Which, I got to the point where I just literally, I could not give up his care for a few hours because the caring was so complicated that without somebody being a professional, it just wasn't possible. But whenever you can take a breath, if you need to, then do it. Nap while they're sleeping is so critical.
Yeah. I think it's a little like in your early stages of bringing up children, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So you nap at the time when the child is sleeping.
Yes. Were there any other questions that I'm actually looking at the chat.
Alison, I have a question personally, and I would say that for us, the series of print and pictures is absolutely essential, because the way that we see our role as an organization is to shift the narrative around caregivers and caregiving. We do think that the kind of stories that are told both in print as well as in pictures, which is films or whatever form, tend to tell stories only in some ways. For example, if we were to look at Hindi cinema and a larger part of English cinema as well, there is stories that are told, the caregiver point of view is so limited. And there is a certain eulogizing or a certain putting it on a pedestal kind of a perspective. And what we would like to do is humanize the whole experience and say, this is rife with all human experience and all human emotions. For this, we need to be able to encourage people to tell their stories, just like you just did about Marty and yourself in some difficult circumstances. This is to just say that people are different, stories can be different. How can we, sorry for the long preface, the simple question is, how can we encourage more caregivers to tell their story like it is, not like stories of victory, but stories as they are?
It's the story I just told you about Marty not looking at me. I mean, that is not an easy story to tell, because it's painful. I think, I don't really want to tell. For one thing, it sort of casts him in not a very positive light.
Yeah.
And I think we're often trained from a young age, don't speak ill of the dead. So it's very hard to say, well, somebody did this rather small-minded thing. But I could also share moments where I was not a great caregiver in certain exhausted moments. My voice might have had a harsh edge. Or sometimes, those moments of having to walk away. Sometimes I had to walk away when he actually needed something, but I needed to walk away to take a break and a breath and cool my head and then get back into what I needed to do. And I think those real moments are really, we need to know them so that that, because along with those moments, there are all the other times when you do the thing that needed to be done, when you have taken the breath and you've come back and you do what needed to be done, and with a good heart, in it. And so we need to look at those too. Like to me, that guilt piece, when I talk about boundaries and guilt, I think that the guilt thing's just got to go off the table. If you've been there and you've cared, then we all know as humans that there are other moments that are not so pretty, but that's part of human life. The older you get, the more interesting it is. And a sense of humor. I mean, I think we haven't talked about humor at all, but I actually, I found, especially as we got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, I would actively think about where's something funny in the day. And, that's one thing that keeping a journal pushed me to think about. Okay, where was the funny moment today? So I have a poem about it. Even at one point, Marty was coming across, he's coming out of the washroom, he's coming across, we had a great big kitchen, dining room, living room all together, and he's pushing his walker across the floor, and he lets out a fart. Well, if there's nothing like really, potty humor, little kid humor when you're taking care of somebody, because there is all that just stuff of taking care of somebody. And, another time he was coming across the room and he's stark naked, and we started talking about streakers. I don't know if you met, back in the 70s, there were streakers running around. And of course, the word streaker, when somebody is slowly pushing a walker, there's that juxtaposition thing again, right? And we were all laughing. And I mean, when ALS happened, it's really actually hard to laugh with your face muscles, but we knew he was laughing and we were all just laughing. And my boys used to do this thing where they would make, screeching brake sounds while he's walking with his and we'd all be howling. So, and I found every day we would look, okay, where's the funny piece in this day? So that became every bit as important as, okay, where's the emotional okay stuff, and where's the healing, and where is that stuff, but where's the humor became really critical. And yeah, sometimes we were like a bunch of 6-year-olds.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I do think that, there can be moments of humor and there can be moments of joy, and these are memories to look back on. It is not for no reason that they say that humor is a fantastic coping mechanism.
Yeah.
You do have to go through the pain. That's as important, but you can go through it better if you can hold the hands of humor.
Yes.
I am so grateful for such a wholesome experience that you have given us today. How would you like to leave the audience with?
Well, I was going to, I thought I would read a couple pages, so it's short, if that's okay, about me returning to my dance classes. Can I do that?
Yes, please.
So this is, as you can see, almost at the end of the book, and it's after Marty's passed. And I don't know how much you know about flamenco dancing. It's really the history of flamenco that drew me to it. It's the Gitano people in caves living in Spain. They were persecuted, and just the idea that these people were so persecuted and sought out and taken away, and yet they chose this incredibly noisy dance form, one of the noisiest dance forms possible, while they're hiding out in their caves. And I love that, again, this juxtaposition of hiding and creating noise, which just seems so amazing to me. So this chapter is called Flamenco Revisited. In the curiously lightened state of aftercare, I had to find a way to kickstart a new normal. The booklet given to me by the funeral home folks called this state euphoric. It was not euphoric. I'll stay with curiously lightened. Tuesday class time, I was in the funeral home signing papers. But Wednesday night came. I put on my skirt. Shoes, castanets, and fan were in their dusty bag. I took them to the car and sat in the driveway. Can I go? Would I remember steps? My muscles might, but would my soul? My skirt hung loosely. Would it swing? Calf muscles ached, shoulders were tight from lifting and setting down with care. Too many nights of not sleep, but naps. What was left of me now? What was left to me? Did I want to know? Would there be joy in my bulerías? Maybe some sorrow in solea? My flamenco teacher, Bev, would drill us on errant body parts and missteps. Application, she would say, apply what you have learned. We live, we learn, but can we apply when the application closes in on terror? In the rapid terror-filled progression of Marty's ALS, there was no time for application, or so little time. But I still felt a need to create noise in my flamenco cave. There was still inside me, I discovered, as I sat in my car in my driveway. Sorry, that was still inside me. For now, that was what I would do or try. There was a sense of wondering how I'd come to be where I was, in my car, going to flamenco class, so normal, so not. A sense of blindly with clear eyes going forward, hoping to God that life would catch up somehow, and when it did, it would find me living. Tammy, the friend who'd helped with the question of when and how to tell the boys, had told me never to turn down any offer of help. That was key. In the early days after Marty passed, I determined that I would never say no to an invite, whether a friend invite or a life invite, to connect with others, to dance, to hear music. I would not hide away. I turned the key. I drove to dance class. I hope you have dance classes to go to and that you go. And thank you so much.
I'm out of words.
Mhm.
Happens very often, but sharing the moment with you and sending you lots of warmth and love from miles across. Thank you for being with us. It's pretty late for you, but we are very, very grateful that you were with us today, and that we got such brilliant insights, such beautiful expression, and we look forward to many, many more authors, thanks to the path that you have set.
Thank you so much for asking me to do this. And it's just been an honor to share. Thank you. I'm waving to Pinakin. Thank you.